Well, good afternoon. I am Neil Smatras, president of UNLV, and it's a pleasure to be part of the 6th Annual Clean Energy Summit. UNLV has been an active partner for all 6 summits with Senator Reid, the Center for American Progress, and the Clean Energy Project, because we want to help Nevada to be a central hub to address the energy needs and challenges of the future. Now, the topic of the panel that you're about to see, resilience to extreme weather, as well as clean energy, are leading areas of research at UNLV. Currently, we have about $50 million worth of projects that we're working on that are externally funded addressing clean energy, water, the environment, and we are actually involving these ideas of sustainability and resilience in approximately 100 relevant academic programs. We have major interdisciplinary activity addressing climate change issues at a statewide project called the Nevada Infrastructure for Climate Change Science, Education and Outreach. Now that's a $20 million grant funded by the National Science Foundation. And this is a collaboration between UNLV, the University of Nevada, Reno, and the Desert Research Institute to evaluate potential impacts of climate change in Nevada and to integrate these issues into our education programs. Along with that, we have environmental monitoring stations in climate-sensitive areas across Nevada, which are streaming real-time data and images so scientists and decision makers can better understand the role of climate and weather on surrounding environmental conditions. Our faculty and students are involved in a whole array of national and international efforts, such as the National Climate Assessment, which is evaluating impacts of climate change on the nation. And we have been publishing very, very actively in such prestigious journals as the National Academy of Science and Science Magazine, sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So as you can see, UNLV is a major hub for the dissemination of current information on sustainability, resilience, and climate change, and we believe that it is a topic that will only grow in activity and interest in the years to come. Nevada and the Southwest have been identified as being vulnerable areas to climate change impact, with more droughts and more extreme events, like the giant forest fire we had on Mount Charleston not long ago. So our faculty and students are taking on this challenge to identify sustainable growth solutions for the region, like the Desert Soul Project that you just saw. UNLV continues to host meetings to lead discussions like the one we're having here today. Last year, we partnered with the prestigious Ditchley Foundation of the UK on water conserving our most precious natural resource. And we recently hosted the National Science Foundation-sponsored Climate Change Science for Effective Resource Management and Public Policy in the Western United States. So, it's great to see the discussion continuing, and it is now my pleasure to welcome John Podesta, the chair of the Center for American Progress, to the stage. He will introduce and moderate the next panel of distinguished guests and experts. Welcome, John.
Do a little stage change here. Well, it's great to be back to the National Clean Energy Summit, and thank you all for hanging in there with us. Following up on my friend Congressman Inglis's comments in the previous panel, we're going to talk on this panel about the real nanny, and that's Mother Nature. This is a new topic. You know, we've spent our last 6 summits, which CAP has been proud to be part of with our partners, and particularly with our great leader, Senator Reid, talking about the future and the investments we need to make in clean energy. But this is sort of a new topic for NCES. Previous speakers have talked about it, but we're really going to concentrate on extreme weather. And I think that couldn't be more timely. Of course, as Neil noted, wildfires rage in Arizona and Nevada, while the Southwest suffers from a parching drought. At the same time, other parts of the country are seeing 100-year floods, I think every 100 months or so these days. We're seeing more extreme weather with increased frequency and increased intensity. To put that into some perspective, in 2011 and 2012, the U.S. experienced 25 severe storms, floods, droughts, and wildfires that each cost more than $1 billion each. Together, those events resulted in over 1,100 fatalities and $188 billion in losses. And again, to keep this in perspective, we're seeing that size event happening now with 5 times more frequency than we saw 30 years ago. The draft National Climate Assessment and several National Academy of Science reports are issuing flashing warnings, in my view, that these problems are only going to get worse. So even as we press the case, as we have done all day, to change our energy systems and mitigate the worst aspects and effects of global warming, we have to ask the question, how do we react to the disruptive effects of climate change and make our communities and our economies more resilient to these events? That is what this panel will discuss. How do we prepare our communities for an increase in the frequency and ferocity of storms, floods, drought, heat, and fires? What are some of the most advanced communities doing to prepare for extreme weather? What role can clean energy play in these efforts? And what role should the federal, state, and local governments be playing to make their communities more resilient? We couldn't have a better panel to discuss it. We've got a diverse range of perspectives. On my immediate left is Dr. Kathryn Sullivan. She's the acting administrator of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration and a former astronaut and a distinguished scientist. To her left is Patricia Mulroy. She is the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, which is delivering water to local agencies, serving more than 2 million people in Southern Nevada. Next to Pat is Maria LaRosa, a meteorologist and co-host of Weekend Now on the Weather Channel, who's been out covering these major storms and extreme weather events. And to Maria's left is Chris Taylor, a former wind power developer and now the executive director of the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, which I'm going to get him to explain. But I'm going to start with Pat Mulroy. Pat, I really want to get, and for this audience in particular, to localize what these effects are really meaning. 90% of Nevada is in severe, extreme, or exceptional drought. We've seen Lake Mead and Lake Powell hit all-time low levels, or at least approaching that. What's this going to mean to the city of Las Vegas and to Southern Nevada as this drought, which has been going on for 3 years, continues? What do you see happening to the community and to the economy here?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for pulling this panel together. I think this is a very timely ending and wrap up for all the discussions that we've had around energy and our needs for change. Because if anybody doubts that there's climate change, I'd welcome them to come to the Colorado River Basin. For the last 13 years, we've been devastated by one dry year after another. We had one wet year that probably saved our life. But here in Southern Nevada, as it is in other parts of the Colorado River Basin, we've been devastated by this drought. And we're probably the hardest hit because we have one of the highest reliances on the Colorado. As you said, it's 90%. And for us, it's become a facilities problem. We have 2 intakes in Lake Mead, one which was completed in 1971, and one which we just recently completed in the mid-90s. And we're looking at losing our upper intake at a minimum and are worried that our second intake is jeopardized. We lose our upper intake, we lose 40% of the capacity we have to bring water into Southern Nevada. That has a devastating effect, and it's had a huge price tag for us. We're right now building the most difficult construction project on the planet. It's the third intake project. We've gone down over 600 feet. We're boring 3.5 miles underneath Lake Mead. The intake structure has been planted in the old original Colorado River channel, and the boring machine will now meet up with it and go into the soft eye. It's costing the citizens of Southern Nevada over $800 million that they never thought they would ever have to spend. It's an emergency project. So now when I hear from Interior that the next 24-month study and this month's 24-month study will set next year's releases, is going to deliver 750,000 acre feet less into Lake Mead, and that the lake is going to drop even faster, for me it becomes a timing problem. Can we get the third intake finished on a schedule that will allow it to happen before we lose the lake? Now, bear in mind that 24-month study assumes 100% of normal precipitation for water year 2014. Well, what if we have another year like this year? That means it's going to come upon us faster. Lake Mead, for those who don't know, Lake Mead is full at elevation 1220. We're currently sitting at 1105, and by April of 2015, and that's with normal hydrology, we'll be sitting at 1062. At this point, our water quality in that upper intake is awful, and the risk of losing it has just astronomically gone up. So for us, it's a survival issue. This community has stepped up like no other when it comes to conservation. We've paid our customers $200 million almost to take their turf out. We've cut our use by a third, knowing that we would experience cutbacks. And so as not to have economic disruptions, we saw the disaster coming and planned for it early and took the community through an orderly conservation program that made permanent, lasting changes. However, what's happening is that the rate of change is speeding up at a pace that we really didn't expect.
Well, that's a perfect segue to you, Kathy, I think, which is, let's take this up to the national and maybe even to the global level. What can we expect? What's your assessment of what the science is showing right now with respect to what the country really needs to be getting its head around to prepare for?
A couple of ways to slice this, John, and let me echo Pat's thanks to you and others for pulling this session together. So Pat cited a couple of statistics and facts of life in her water region that are telling this tale. And water managers across, especially the western states, the United States, I think are really the guys right on the front line of this, living it every day. But let's look at some other statistics. California, their EPA just put a report out, reported on today in the Chronicle, tracking a basket of 36 indicators to try to monitor what's happening with the state. In the 12 years since 2000, the average acreage burned each year in California was 50 times bigger, twice as big as the preceding 50 years average. That's up. Temperatures have been going up consistently throughout their recorded record, and as Pat indicated, have accelerated since 1975. Take it to the global level. If you live in the United Kingdom, the likelihood that you'll have a cold December is only half what it was 40 years ago. But the likelihood that you'll have a warm November is 62 times higher. So everywhere you want to turn, whether it's daytime high temperatures, nighttime low temperatures, which are also getting higher, that brings us to human health risks not far down the road. Every place you turn, the indicators really are telling us we are seeing more frequent extremes, more intense extremes, and when you look at the global averages on key parameters like temperature, you can see very quickly why that's happening. You have a nice bell curve anywhere on the planet of occasional very cold temperatures and occasional super warm temperatures, and most temperatures in the middle. The middle of that curve is shifting to the right at almost every global location, hotter, and the curve is getting kind of flatter. And what that means is, if you look at the tail of the curve that tells you how many times am I going to have extreme weather, if it used to be down here, not that many times, it's now up here. So more extreme, the peak of something is further and more intense, and you're going to see that more frequently. The planet's a variable place. This doesn't mean every day, all the time, always the same pattern, but it means the vulnerability of our infrastructure, our communities, our economy is beginning to operate in an environment that defies all of the presumptions we planned upon.
But before I turn to Maria and get the view from the ground up, you right at the end mentioned the intensity of storms. We had Superstorm Sandy last year. We had Katrina a few years ago. What's your anticipation of what particularly the East Coast and the Gulf Coast are going to experience in the near future?
Well, the science around tropical cyclones and hurricanes doesn't let us say anything yet, at least, about potential landfall patterns. But a warmer atmosphere holds more energy, holds more moisture, and the best projections scientifically say probably about neutral in the number of storms we see, but the intensity, the total power of those storms likely to go up.
Maria, you'll forgive me for saying this, but you may be in one of the few businesses in which all this freaky weather is good for business. But like I said, you're out there on the front lines. You're talking to people in communities that have really been devastated and affected by the extreme weather. How are they perceiving this? Do they see it as kind of one-off examples, or do they see patterns in what's been happening in the last few years?
Well, I think I'm first going to say that there is an awareness of weather, an awareness of climate that we haven't seen in past years. And it starts young. I have 3 kids. They've all had weather lessons already and can speak about what's happening outside. They can kind of understand why it's raining. So I think there's a dialogue. A lot of people are talking about the weather. We're sharing the weather on social media. We're kind of Monday morning quarterbacks, with the weekend storm, talking about, hey, did you see this happening? But I think there is still an uphill battle when it comes to communicating what we potentially could be seeing and dealing with in the future when it comes to extreme weather. And that's, from an extreme event to the whole climate change conversation. One anecdote I have for that is during Hurricane Sandy, I'm from New Jersey. 90% of the people I know and love the most were in the path. And I was constantly getting text messages and phone calls and people asking me, really, what's going to happen? No, really, what's really going to happen? And my father called me, and he lives down the shore, and he asked me, all right, they've put out the mandatory evacuation. Do I really need to evacuate? And it hit me that my father is doubting the message being sent here, and I couldn't quite understand why that was happening. I think there's almost this inherent optimism that it's not going to be that bad, it's not going to happen to me. And what I can laugh about it now, what got him to leave was I said, you're not going to be the dad of the meteorologist that stayed behind and had to be rescued. So he evacuated. But I think that hits home the fact that there's still this, it's coming around. The public is coming around to the fact that not only are more of us experiencing extreme weather and dealing with it, but we're paying the price for it, and we are aware of it. I think that the conversation definitely still needs some working on, in that there's still that sense, I can see it on the TV, and I know it's out there, but I'm still not convinced it's going to happen to me. And I think that can be dangerous, obviously.
You know, John, we see this pattern too in faster onset events like tornadoes, and even in Tornado Alley, where the forecasting skill of the National Weather Service is very highly trusted. People get the message, they hear it on TV, and their first instinct, frankly, in Tornado Alley is to rush outside and look. But the next instinct really is to look for a second and a third trusted signal. And this is one of the places where I think social media really is helping on the short-term events, weather events, because it's the text from your spouse or your mother or your daughter saying, no, really, go. That's finally overcoming the social and the sort of complacency barriers and getting people underway. Mm-hmm. So good, that works with hurricanes if you've got a TV weather broadcaster or daughter and social media in Tornado Alley. What do we do on these slow onset events? What does it take to signal enough trust, to signal enough information that I understand that really starts to change how I look at the future and what I'm prepared to do?
Well, in fact, there are actually people that will come to our board meetings and say, you're making this up. You're making this up just to raise rates. And I'm going, really?
Do you offer free rides out to Lake Mead?
Absolutely.
Well, we've kind of opened up actually through a different avenue this issue of infrastructure, because the social media, telecommunications, the ability to provide information is one part of the infrastructure revolution that we need, I think, to inform people. But Chris, you've started now, you're just stood up the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, which is intended to make smart investments in a broader range of infrastructure. Tell us a little bit about the exchange and what it's intended to do.
Sure. Thanks very much, and thanks again for the panel. So the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange was formed at the end of 2012 by the governors and treasurers of the West Coast states and the province of BC to really address the $1 trillion of investment that's going to be required across that region over the next 30 years to keep pace with aging infrastructure and population growth. And we just don't have the resources currently to do anything close to that. Doing things the traditional way. So we're looking at both trying to make smarter investments, make those dollars go farther by changing the way we contract for things, by changing the way we plan in a more long-term integrated way, and also by trying to attract more private capital to these investments. The same way we've been talking about energy all day, that's what I did for the last 12 years. All of my projects were financed by private parties because there's a functioning market for that, but we haven't really created that across the spectrum and infrastructure. And as part of our focus on smarter infrastructure, climate resilience is something we're trying to drive down to the local levels. The regional organization, our target is really state and local partners. And the reality is that across just the 3 states, you've got probably 500 counties and cities. Do all of them have the resources to be up to the minute on what's happening with future climate change? No, they don't, but they're all making important investments that are significant investments for their communities. And there are, we're trying to focus on systems, not projects. The current way things get funded, whether it's in our state legislatures or in Congress, is somebody gets a lot of political momentum around a project, and it's not looked at as how is this fit in as part of a system. And if you're talking about resilience, it's all about systems. It's not just this one piece, but how does that fit in with the other parts of the system? And the example from Hurricane Sandy that's been talked about a lot was that one facility in New Jersey that went down, eliminated the entire fuel supply for the metropolitan area, and nobody had thought that through before. That's an extreme example, but that's some of the thinking that we're trying to engender in these plans.
Well, and to tee off on that, I mean, one of the things that those of us in the water business need more than anything else are better predictive tools. I mean, we have spent, past generations of water managers, and it doesn't matter whether you're in New York, you're Los Angeles, you're Miami, you're Cincinnati, or you're Chicago, you look in the rearview mirror, and then you establish probabilities based on what has happened in the past. Well, climate change has changed all that. The rearview mirror, you can take it and you can throw it away. It has limited utility. We haven't found that new predictive tool, that new set of computer runs or computer programs that will allow us to assess it. And this is where I'm going to have to say something pretty terse. What the federal government needs to do more than anything else is invest in science. We sitting on the ground, it is very difficult for us to be able to develop that resilient infrastructure and then go to ratepayers and collect hundreds of millions of dollars to build facilities in the absence of those predictive tools. If there's one place where the federal government is better at doing the research, it has the better computers, it has the science. Who has a better computer than NASA? Why are we not using those tools? And why are we not investing in that science that we here on the ground at the state and local level need so desperately?
Well, Kathy, I appreciate that. Kathy's going to tell you that people that have better computers than NASA is NOAA, and so. But I think she teed it up.
As an alumni of both agencies, I can say we.
I knew you wouldn't slug me for NASA.
But Pat raises, there are a couple of really good points embedded in what Pat just said, and I agree with the fundamental premise. I think the scientific knowledge is one of the key foundational elements the federal government has a unique and I think necessary role in providing. It's not the kind of work that companies or water districts are going to do. It's not focused and short-term enough. But we've got a couple of challenges we need to solve in that arena too. One is the capabilities we have today in global climate change prediction. Predictions You run 50-year resource plans, predictions that are that many decades or more out into the future. They were driven not by Pat's questions. The formulation of them was not driven by helping Pat build answers to her questions. It was driven much more by the drive and the need to get at fundamental understanding of the planet's own processes. So the capabilities we have today still have that heritage of being driven by those foundational questions. We need a research strategy at the federal level that shifts towards these new questions. I liken it to the way the National Institutes of Health some decades ago moved strongly into translational medicine and that kind of research. It builds off the fundamental foundation, it builds off the process understanding, but it's very much more oriented towards meeting the clinical needs of someone on the ground trying to solve real problems. This is what always draws me back to NOAA as a place to work, because the easy core way to think about NOAA across all of our programs is heart and soul. We exist to provide the critical environmental intelligence that Pat needs to take that fundamental understanding of the planet, to transform it through appreciation and awareness of the issues and the questions people are trying to solve in the real world, and turn that into information products, decision tools, the kind of media that you need. We've got a lot of work to do as a country to figure out that new investment strategy, and I think all of us in this game, in this environmental intelligence game, have some work to do at this interface between communities and with you to be sure that what we're producing and how we're producing it connects as effectively as possible to what you need. And then finally, I think we've all got some things to learn about how do we actually make these big go-forward decisions. We do weather forecasts by predict and act. We predict and you act. You decide whether to take your raincoat. You decide whether to leave the Jersey Shore with Sandy. When the timescales are decades and half centuries, we're not going to see the completion of that. We don't have the feedback loop that tells us how sound is this forecast. So we're going to have to deal with the challenge of how do we figure out, as you guys did really, Pat, I need something that's robust against things I can't be certain about. What's that course, and how do we come together to take that course of action? As opposed to, when you can give me a perfectly certain prediction, then maybe I'll act. That's going to fail us on these long time scale problems.
So, Maria, let me come back to you and talk about how the public reacts to all this. Kathy sort of raised the difference between providing information for acute challenges, the tornado is coming, the hurricane's going to hit, versus these chronic challenges, the long term. One of the things that happens, I think, over and over again is, as I'm listening to my local weather person or I'm watching the Weather Channel, is they say, well, we can't say any particular weather event is located in a pattern around climate change or changing weather patterns, et cetera. And that's probably right. You can't locate that. But how do you think about, in terms of your doing public education, when you're on-air broadcasting, about what these longer-term challenges look like for people?
I always think about, people want to know how everything impacts them. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to my neighborhood, my family? I think people aren't quite ready or can't see all the dots that are being laid out right now. So a lot of people will say, well, Poland had a very harsh winter this year. But Alaska's had this amazing stretch of 80-degree days. Well, the ice cap is melting, but the Antarctic is growing. So they see these events to kind of bolster whatever they're thinking about climate change. Well, the ice is getting bigger down across the South Pole, so that means that we're fine. But Alaska had this amazing stretch of 80-degree days, so that means we're melting. I feel like it's my job to help people connect those dots and say, well, it's not just that one event, it's not just that event either, it's everything connected, and it's everything that's been going on for the last month, the last year, the last 10 years. So I think that part of educating the public is taking them out of their neighborhood and saying it's something that is connected and is continued. There's a feedback loop that we don't quite fully understand, but we know is happening and is having an impact on whether that is happening at this very moment. So that is something that we'll have to continue to educate people on.
Do you feel like the light bulbs are going on now, particularly when you're in the aftermath of these extreme events?
I think it comes down to what people have experienced, and just the mere fact of Hurricane Sandy, for example, hits major metro areas, New York City, millions of people experienced it. I think by default, you have more people, more light bulbs going off because they experienced it. And I think the more you can show people what's happening and make them feel that experience, even if they're not directly experiencing it at that moment, that's important to the storytelling. It's important to making those light bulbs go off.
Chris, you're dealing with policymakers and elected officials, et cetera. For them, how are they making judgments about, we've talked a lot about water, but roads, bridges, the resiliency of power transmission and power generation. Are they beginning to incorporate a planning model that looks towards resilience, or is there still resistance, or are there economic drivers that push them away from that?
So I mean, I'm fortunate with the West Coast states that you can say climate, you can say carbon, and you don't get laughed off the stage. So I'm fortunate to work with elected officials who are pretty outspoken in their belief that climate change is real and we need to do something about it. But they don't have all the power that's necessary. And I would say that's not true at the local level. When you get east of I-5, pretty much anywhere along the West Coast, views change pretty radically about these things. But as far as the tools, I think it's a mix. Some agencies in some states and some localities actually have pretty sophisticated thinking about this. There's good research being done at the University of Washington and places in California. Some of that's getting incorporated, but it's very hit and miss. There's no comprehensive across the board plan. And in many of our states, in Oregon, for instance, there is no long-term capital plan of any nature. So there certainly isn't one that deals with climate resilience. So unless you're having long-term planning and thinking about this stuff, you don't even really have a venue for plugging in climate resilience. And I very much agree that's an important role for the federal government to provide not just the predictions, but okay, what's the best practice? That's what we hope to be able to do, is to share that best practice. What have other people figured out about how to do with this? You've been dealing with water shortages longer than a lot of jurisdictions. There's going to be a whole bunch of people around the country that are going to end up in the position that Southern Nevada is in 10 or 15 years from now. So what can we learn instead of having them reinvent the wheel and go through all the trial and error that others have gone through? That's the kind of practical information that agency directors, local officials are really striving for, and they just don't have a lot of bandwidth. I mean, they just don't have that many hours in the day to think about these things, and they don't have a lot of resources.
Kathy, we keep pushing this back to what can the federal government do to provide more information, more transparency, more tools. On the acute side, there's probably bipartisan support for the mission of the agency. But on the chronic side, there's been resistance to giving you the resources and the tools that you need to make these kind of long-term predictions in Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives. So talk a little bit about the challenge of being able to steer an agency from one mission, which is critical, to another mission, which may be even more critical.
Right, so underneath whatever product domain you want to talk about at NOAA, the mission is to understand the planet. And the planet operates on a continuous array of timescales, from very short to very long. So if doing any of your work requires that you understand the planet, you've got to be looking across all of those timescales and understanding how they relate together. You've characterized it pretty well, John. Everyone adores and loves to have good weather forecasts, thinks very highly of NOAA and the National Weather Service. But yes, there's a bill pending on the Hill right now that would propose that NOAA focus entirely on short-term weather forecasting and stop and repurpose any funds that are going to climate. But, interestingly, and I'll give you a great anecdote. So this bill would say focus on tornadoes and hurricanes. Well, a number of years ago, we launched a hurricane forecast improvement program. When I was chief scientist at NOAA back in the early 90s, we would give you a 3-day outlook for hurricanes. There was no real skill or meaningful information beyond that. And the error bar 3 days out was a very wide swath of where the storm might hit. For Irene, for Sandy, we're giving 5-day cones, 7-day outlooks, and quite narrow. People are not having to evacuate where they don't need to. How did that come about? We went to emergency managers, and we said, what do you need? Not just what do scientists want to do next, what do you need? I said, I need 80% confidence on a 4-day forecast and good consistency from 4 to 3, because my decisions come at 3 days. Am I starting to move people out of harm's way? So I need consistency and I need that reliability. Then we got scientists in and say, where do you think the leverage points are that move us to that kind of confidence level? The answer turned out to be incorporating climate trends and climate data into what we already knew about the short-term challenge of modeling a vortex and modeling jet stream winds. And until you put that longer pattern into the equation, you weren't going to break through that skill barrier on hurricanes. That's just one example, but I could go through many, many others. Understanding the planet on any time scale pertinent to our decisions requires us to be able to investigate across all of those time scales, follow the science. So yes, we're having that problem. We're having that debate at the national level. Not just NOAA, by the way. Every agency essentially that has anything labeled climate in its program budgets is being challenged to not make those investments. Any action plans, any technical support services we provide to communities, our outreach through our National Integrated Drought Information System partnership, multiple agencies closely working with Pat and her colleagues in the western states. Those sorts of efforts, from the science to the translation to the people who need it, those are all challenged by this climate, no pun intended. But a flip side, we also have a memorandum of understanding, NOAA does, with the Western Governors Association, many of whose members don't want to hear either of the C words, but they absolutely want Pat to have the information she needs, and their ranchers and their agriculturalists to have the kind of information they need to make their plans. So that's the quandary. They know it's needed on the ground in their states for their constituents, but the broader philosophical picture is in tension with that.
Maria, my favorite event on climate that we did in the Clinton White House was we invited all the local weather reporters to broadcast their on the White House lawn, from the south lawn of the White House. And it was probably raised people's understanding and awareness more than anything else we did in the second term of. And I actually like to ask you to react to what Kathy was saying. Do local meteorologists now kind of get this connection between the extreme and being able to understand how the extreme weather is fitting into long-term patterns? And do they use that in their regular broadcasts? It seems like it's the most powerful tool for public education.
I think if you ask any meteorologist in broadcasting or behind the scenes, what is the bread and butter of what you do every day? And it is the nowcasting and the short-term forecasting. But no doubt we have every hour an update on the tropics, and a lot of times it talks about climatology. Well, looking back at this storm, every storm that formed here, and took this track over the last century of record keeping. So climatology and looking back and understanding how everything works is incredibly important into what we do in nowcasting and forecasting. So I think every meteorologist understands the importance of not just the short term, but absolutely the long term. And I think everybody, the viewers, they want to hear how the summer is going to be. So we have 3-month outlooks. Well, that takes a little bit of nowcasting, but a big understanding of climatology and the broader weather picture.
I want your father to know that the future is in your hands. The planet's future is in your hands.
So just to close the loop on that, the 3-month outlook that NOAA produces that is shared by our broadcasters depends critically on ongoing monitoring of the tropical Pacific Ocean. It's the upper ocean, it's the thermal structure, it's the winds above. You can't have a 3-month outlook unless you're running what's called a climate observing array across the Pacific Ocean. You want the 3-month outlook, or do you want to cut the line that says climate observing system?
Pat, you raised earlier the effort that was massive that happened here in Las Vegas to de-lawn the city of Las Vegas and take up the lawns here to reduce water usage. The New York Times paid homage to the Las Vegas program in a story they did yesterday on Los Angeles following your suit to provide incentives to do that. But 70% of the water used in the West is used for agriculture. And so I want to ask you, have we moved to a point where we have to restructure agriculture in the West. Can agriculture in a desert climate really be sustainable? Do we have to think about different patterns of production for agriculture in the West?
Well, you know, John, I look at that very differently. And the last thing I think we need is a confrontation between agriculture and urban right now. Are there new technologies, new growing sciences that will allow us to grow more food? I look at this in the macro sense. You're talking about feeding a planet that will soon have 9 billion people. You're talking about agricultural areas that today comprise 11% of the country's fresh winter fruits and vegetables, that export $1.5 billion worth of agricultural produce into Asia. You don't just shut them down. You don't choose between ag and urban. But in my mind, there is a really symbiotic relationship there. Municipalities, through their populations, through their rate bases, through their ability to generate money, can help agricultural areas make some modifications. They can help them make some of the on-farm changes that need to happen so they can grow more food with less water. Let me share with you some programs that exist on the river right now. Metropolitan has an arrangement with the Palo Verde Irrigation District in Southern California, where they temporarily fallow the farms on a rotational basis. It hasn't shut the community down. It hasn't affected anything. And they've been storing that water in Lake Mead. Because of our efforts, when we're doing the same thing on the Virgin and the Muddy Rivers, which are tribs into the Colorado, Lake Mead is 10 feet higher today than it would be normally. We'd currently be sitting at 1095. So agriculture is going to continue to exist. I think the Israelis would push back hard against you, saying we have to wipe out agriculture in the desert. Whether you go to the Near East, whether you go into the desert Southwest in the United States, it's how do we do it? What's that next generation of technology? What science can we bring to bear? And where is that partnership during really difficult times that the agricultural community can help level the playing field without taking all the pain and having this constant fear that they live with, that the cities are going to come in and shut them down?
That's a great point, and I think the point of partnership is really critical. And at the federal level, you've made a big push for science in terms of long-term forecasting. But what about on these questions of new technology, particularly in the agricultural space?
You're going to see a lot of things changing. I think those classic mom and pop urban water utilities are now really looking at pushing the whole technology and innovation sphere. For example, we've got a partnership with Meteorologist. And one of the things Meteorologist's done really well is they've built an internal infrastructure in their organization where they put out RFIs globally. And they say, we need innovations in this area. And so they invite the world of innovation to find out, and they harvest that which has potential to test. And so we're joining our forces to do a lot of this in partnership, make our dollar go further, make our spread go further. This is also where the federal government can come in. We've got to stop thinking about the only appropriate place for federal dollars is once the disaster has occurred, let's fix it. How about avoiding it? Take the Dutch mantra or take the Israeli mantra, which is we want to avoid the disaster happening. What can we do today? Where can we strategically invest? For example, can we have a national water strategy, not a policy that tries to put Boston in the same boat with Vegas and Phoenix, but where can we have a national water strategy that looks to push the innovation, looks to push the technology, and makes smart, strategic investments in creating tomorrow's innovations that we're going to have. And what is most frightening to me is that we're running out of time while we're arguing about it. And it's to that extent that the municipalities are really starting to say, we're just going to have to go out there and start it and let others follow.
That's great. Great. Please. To Pat's point, to put in a plug for the Center for American Progress, it's actually hard to find in the federal budget, but we calculate that there are, for every $6 that are spent on disaster expenditures after the fact, we're only spending $1 for resilience and trying to prevent disasters, to your point, Pat. And for every $1 you spend on resilience, you get a $4 return. So our accounts are really off base, I think, both at the national level and at the federal level. Chris, what's the role of bondholders and insurance in pushing for change, in making accurate calculations of long-term costs of building out infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the insurance industry is playing and can play a very significant role, and I think we've seen that in other fields, whether it's car safety or other things, where there was a lot of money at stake, and they recognized that that was a risk to their profitability and to their policies. I think climate is a classic example. I think one of the problems is that some of these things get subsidized by the government through disaster relief, so that gets pushed off onto the taxpayer rather than to some private party that would be more mobilized to do something about it. But you do see activism on the part of quite a few insurers, institutional investors, and groups like Ceres and others that represent investors that have sort of some kind of a social mission or conscience. They're pushing these agendas and trying to get that information out there and force people to evaluate what are the risks that you're really bearing, because a lot of people probably haven't fully disclosed that or even fully understand it. But I think at the end of the day, there's an even more fundamental sort of business case, which is, to me, the simple analogy is this is like, your roof is leaking and you do nothing about it, and you wait until the entire roof collapses on your head, maybe kills your family, and then ruins everything in your home. I mean, that would be an imprudent decision for a homeowner. If you were a business owner, you'd never let that happen at your place of business. But that's what, as a society, we're doing. I mean, it's that commonsensical that these investments not only do, as the CAP research shows, those investments, I think, yield something like a 4x multiple. For $1 of prevention, you get about $4 of savings. I think that was a FEMA study on the disaster side. But that really understates the benefits, because if you think about these things again as systems, as part of an integrated plan, you can get multiple benefits at once. So if you're going to tear up the street and improve a 100-year-old sewer line, you can also make the water delivery system more efficient. You can maybe have better stormwater management with more infiltration, get your broadband while you're at it. There's a bunch of different things you can do at once that have broader economic benefits. And it's a good investment for us as a society. And I think the problem is that there's a lot of different silos of decision making, even within one jurisdiction. This scenario I just described, in most cities would probably be 5 or 6 different departments that would be involved there. That's a real problem, that we're failing to see the big picture.
Well, he spoke to a very interesting point, and that's something that we don't talk about very often, which is what is the economic cost to this country of constantly having to fix what we didn't prevent. And to that end, there is a coalition of water utilities that's called the Water Utility Climate Alliance. And it's a really diverse group of cities. It's ourselves, it's Seattle, it's Portland, San Francisco, Metropolitan, San Diego, Denver, New York City, and Tampa. And we're starting to say, we need people to start thinking about adapting. To me, adapting means, what do we do to prevent and to protect our economy and to protect our communities? One strategy that we are looking at, and we're going to be reaching out, is I think it needs to be an across various industry with the same message. Let's partner up with the insurances. Michael and I have talked about it. Michael Yakira and I have talked about it. With the electrical industry, with the insurance industry, with the transportation industry, all of which are affected by this. We need to send collectively the same message, that this destruction is sucking the life out of our economies. Fix it. Stop trying to pay for the barn after it's burned down.
One of the problems one runs into, I guess politically, is the Congress tried to fix the federal flood insurance program by trying to raise the real cost of providing that insurance to people who are living in the flood zone. But people back where you come from, Maria, people on the Gulf Coast are now having sticker shock about what that really means to actually have their homes and businesses in the floodplain. So how do you, do you hear about that and when you're out and about? And, you know, should we, what's the balance between providing federal assistance to people who are used to living in places that were now at least in the floodplain versus putting them more into the real market, you know, giving them real economic exposure?
I mean, it's always difficult when you're talking to a homeowner who loves where they live and loves the land that they've lived on maybe 20, 30 years and watched their families grow up. But there's that question is, we know we can, but should we? You know you can build along the shore, but should we? And then you have the issue of the government stepping in and saying, well, we're basically going to make it too expensive for you to live here anymore, or we're going to make it not possible for anybody to rebuild here. And you know, you have to consider, you know, again, in the long term, is that going to end up saving communities money down the line, you know, not having to rebuild or not having to go in there and bail people out. In the case of Sandy along the Jersey Shore, you know, they're talking about forcing people to raise their homes. A lot of people are finding out that's very expensive to do if you've already have a home there to raise it up. So a lot of families are being faced with the question is, you know, do you relocate? So I think that's, you know, a question that has to be asked because Sandy is not a one-time deal. It looks like it's going to be something that the Jersey Shore is going to have to face again. Even though I think if you ask people down the shore, they might say, well, it can't get that bad again. I mean, that has to be the worst that it's going to be.
But is there really a place in the United States that's safe? I mean, so we now look at the people at the Jersey Shore and we say, should they live there? I can look at the people who live in Tornado Alley and say, well, should they really live there? Or you can look at the people who live on the mountains who are suffering from forest fires and losing their homes and say, well, they should know better than to live there. Or you look at the desert and you say, well, people shouldn't be living in the desert. Share with me, John, where should we live?
So, John, the other point to make on this score is we're talking the United States of America, and just as a matter of geography and the physics of the planet, this country has the greatest variety and frequency and intensity of weather phenomena, literally, of anywhere on the planet. And then
Maybe we shouldn't live here in this country.
Maybe it's the planet.
It's the planet.
It's the planet.
Could you go, astronauts, go find that next planet, please?
They're looking for it.
Hurry up.
Yeah, they're looking for it. But I guess the other piece of the question that you put to Maria is, where do we put our collective efforts? Do we put our collective efforts into all of us making it financially possible for some of us to live in a floodplain or in an earthquake zone? Or do we each take that decision as an individual responsibility and we put our collective efforts into the systems that can make us more resilient? Yes, there are three primary colors here. It's capital, and policy and finance. And if we can get those three colors aligned, then we can get somewhere.
Well, I think Pat thinks all people should live in caves, and I'm really just asking the tough questions so that we could find solutions where we really can get to partnership and make the right kind of smart investments in the science and in the in the resilient resources that are necessary to make sure that we can live in these great places all across America.
And all I was saying, John, is then let's stop being critical when something bad happens, like a Sandy. Let the rest of us stop saying they shouldn't live there. Because look at where you live. And what's your exposure to some form of extreme weather or extreme event that is coming about as a result of climate change? None of us are immune.
That's why it's important to get this topic on the table and make the right kind of strategic investments. And I'm going to close, because people would want me to, as the first woman to walk in space and a person who's actually lived in space. How cool was that?
It's, thank you. It is the world's coolest way to serve your country. It is one heck of a great view, and you would all love zero gravity. Buy the ticket if you have the chance.
All All right, that's our ultimate solution to climate change. But join me in thanking this great panel. Thanks.